Dr. Steinberg, really appreciate you coming and talking to us at the conference. And this year's theme was the evolution of critical media literacy. I mean, do you see an evolution? You've been doing this work a long time. Do you have any comments about where we've been and where we're going and where we can go?
Right. I think definitely of media literacy, there's a huge evolution. First of all, media literacy doesn't exist everywhere.
Okay.
So for a country or two countries in North America especially that are governed by media, to TV, to sports, to movies, to radio, to music, we have no discussion with children, as really mostly with parents and teachers, about what it is we're consuming. So a teacher will show a movie for a fun thing or for social studies, but there's no evaluation or discussion. So even little media literacy hasn't been used. When we criticalize media literacy, we start to become responsible for power that surrounds it, like who made this? How much did it cost? What was the agenda? What are the points that come out of this? How is the narrative changed because of this media? And this is something that's just starting to grow and become more and more important. And I think that's why your conference comes at a good time. You've come right smack in the middle. I have to say that MEF, Media Education Foundation, was so jolly. They've been around about 20 years and they've done an excellent job. But it's amazing how few people have seen their work. And here it is, free online. You can borrow it. And so I think that even with a really mega money good nonprofit like they are, it's still not being disseminated. I would say that where it needs to go is we need to be affecting policy and curriculum. And maybe that should be done through social studies and English. Those would be the two classes that I think, and maybe foreign language classes, because then we could talk about stereotypes. But we have got to find a way in our countries to get to policymakers so that when curriculum is designed and conversations are created, that the most important thing to me, which changes our kids' lives, media, is being discussed. And it's not.
So those are great comments. What can we expect from your keynote address? What are you going to be talking to us about today?
Well, I'm going to actually do a bricolage
Okay.
on how I sort of do research on media, from the beginning of telling my story to historicizing it, and then starting to look at image, how cameras work, who paid for it, and all those things. So I'm actually doing a research bricolage on media literacy about what I believe has created Islamophobia. Like, you know, I'm old enough to have lived through the Vietnam War, and while it was still a war of propaganda, it was very little, just like actually the war with the Japanese. There was language, there was hatred of Asian people, and certainly people were interred because of it. And in Vietnam, this happened a bit, but mostly it was about fighting the communists. It was more about the ideology. And so we didn't see it during that war. But with Islamophobia, and I believe it's been the buildup of media images in 40 years, all of a sudden we have such a bank of images we can pull out to show you the evil, barbaric, nomadic guy swinging an enormous sword. So it's very easy to depict Muslims and Arabs as mysterious robbers from the East with
Definitely.
veils and all
Definitely.
those kind of things. So it was very easy to pin this on them.
Definitely.
And so I think that that's an important conversation.
Great, and so we definitely look forward to that keynote, and appreciate you having you here today. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's been great. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm going to go ahead and start. My name is Barbara Meyer. I am the Associate Dean in the College of Education here at Illinois State University, and I would like to welcome you to the CMLC conference. We hope you will enjoy your time here at the conference and learn more about the impact media has on our lives. Now, this conference highlights, as you know, conference highlights the need to promote critical media literacy to eliminate social inequalities and foster participatory democracy during the 21st century. The evolution of critical media literacy focuses on the past, current, and future trends in critical media literacy, and our keynote speaker does just this. Those of you familiar with critical literacy, youth studies, and urban culture are already familiar with Dr. Shirley Steinberg's work, as well as her as a person. She's professor at Youth Studies at University of Calgary. She is the founding director of Werklund Foundation Center for Youth Leadership and Education. She is known as a teacher, speaker, author, and editor as well, and her passion for providing a voice to our youth is evident in many parts of the world. I think I need to speak for all of us when I say we look forward to hearing her today. This conference is an opportune time to examine the impact of mass media on society and to propose strategies to assure that it serves as a tool to promote democracy and social justice. One of the great opportunities that take place with conferences is connecting with people with similar interests and different perspectives. I also have a challenge for you as experts or inquirers on the topic and themes of today's conference. Conferences should never stop at the door when we leave. This information and knowledge that we obtain at conferences should be shared. Critical media literacy impacts everyone, but not everyone is aware of this as a strand of research. I challenge you to speak with those unfamiliar with the research, to share what you have learned today with those that are less familiar. And I hope that your research and resulting discussions today contribute to the advancement of knowledge in this area. Thank you for your scholarly contributions today and for making this year's conference a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer, for those remarks and for representing ISU. My name is Nicholas Hartlep, and I'm one of many who are responsible today for planning and hosting today's event. I just want to say a few remarks, and then I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Rochelle Brock, who will be doing a nice introduction to our speaker today. Doing this work can be lonely, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't recognize critical scholars who we've lost. We've lost a lot of them in the past couple of years. So in no particular order, and certainly not a complete exhaustive list, I'd like to take a moment of silence for these critical scholars. Jean Anyon, Robert Dardenne, Greg Dimitriadis, Teshom Gabriel, Hanno Harnt, William Watkins, John Goodlad, and Maxine Green, especially for the Foundation's folks. If we could just take a moment of silence for remembering them. Okay, I'd like to also, it's odd, right? It's like, did I take enough time? We were indebted to their work, so I'm glad we paid homage to them as well. Last remarks, I'd like to thank our sponsors and supporters who have given generously to support this conference. California State University at East Bay, Peter Lang, who gave us these books, Challenging the Media, Media Education Foundation, B-Press, certainly ISU. I'd like to formally thank the Dean of the College of Education, Associate Dean Barb Meyer, as well as the past Tricia Class, who's helped tremendously now 2 years, and especially my GA and TAs. I'd like to thank them for doing, getting here at 6:30 in the morning and bringing me coffee. I mean, whoa, what GA does that? Superstars. I'd like to thank the doc students and the faculty who have supported. So without further ado, I'd like to call up Dr. Brock, and then she'll introduce Shirley.
Hi, I am so happy to introduce and to give you a little bio of Dr. Shirley Steinberg, otherwise known as my BFF, best friend forever, okay? So Shirley's research interests: youth studies, cultural studies, critical pedagogy, critical literacy, radical love, diversity, and a whole bunch more. Shirley Steinberg is Research Professor of Youth Studies, formerly the Werklund Foundation Chair and the Director of the Werklund Foundation Center for Youth Leadership Studies at the University of Calgary. She is the co-founder and director of the Paulo and Nita Freire International Project for Critical Pedagogy, the author and editor of many books in critical literacies, critical pedagogy, urban and youth culture, and cultural studies. Her most recent books include Critical Youth Studies and Critical Qualitative Research Reader, both of which won the AESA Critics' Choice Award this year. A regular contributor to CBC Radio 1, CTV, the Toronto Globe and Mail, the Montreal Gazette and Canadian Press. She is also a weekly columnist for CTV News Channel on Culture Shock. Now, these are all channels in Canada, which is why we don't recognize the names. She is an internationally known speaker and teacher. She is also the founding editor of Taboo, the Journal of Culture and Education, and the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Critical Pedagogy, the organizer of the International Institute for Critical Pedagogy and Transformative Leadership. She is committed to a global community of transformative educators and community workers engaged in radical love, social justice, and the situating of power within social and cultural contexts. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Shirley considers herself an expert on vaginas. She has, see if you guys are actually listening to me. She has been the director of the Vagina Monologues for the last 3 years in the only Calgary production of the play. Without further ado, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Steinberg.
And you know, we told her she was getting an award, and it totally flew over my head. You know, that shows how much stuff I'm thinking about, making sure all of your food's on time and shuttling you around. So I take it out of the plastic. I didn't want to scratch it up. And Rochelle, we're gonna. It's our honor today. Come on in. To present Dr. Steinberg with the Lifetime Achievement Award in Critical Media Literacy Education. On the plaque, it reads, presented to Dr. Shirley R. Steinberg, but very special and important, reads a quote by Paulo Freire, and I want to read it to us all. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes a practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. And it's taken from Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So congratulations, Dr. Steinberg, 3rd Annual Critical Media Literacy Conference Lifetime Achievement Award.
Thank you. I love a Lifetime Achievement Award. That means I don't have to do anything anymore. Or it'll be, oh, thank God we gave it to her this year. We didn't know this was going to happen. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, and we got water, and then so.
Okay. And this is me.
Yep, and so
I need a thingy deal to push.
just an arrow right here.
You know, when you're a media professor, you never claim to absolutely have any idea how media works. And usually your expectation is when you do decide to use media, it won't work anyhow. So I always come with that knowledge, and I'm always sort of surprised when it does work. Is the PowerPoint on?
Yep, it's on, so you just do the arrow, and then we're ready. Yep,
Okay.
and here's the mic.
Boy.
And we're camera.
Martha's PowerPoint.
Martha's
Yep,
ready.
the PowerPoint's ready. No, she said, is it ready? It's ready.
Martha's.
Oh, I thought, no, oh.
Yeah, you were doing all that.
I didn't see anything. Her jump drive, here you go.
I rest my case. What do you want file is this? Oh,
Right here.
yeah. Good news is nice. Can you make it large? Can I just push this to go down? Okay.
Sorry. I thought it was up.
This does not have a cup holder, does it? Okay. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I'm glad that Rochelle shared my deep, most expertise with you in my directing of the play. It's really an honor to be here. I was very excited when 3 years ago this conference was established, and it's cool. It's a really cool conference, and it's, to me, what I call a grassroots conference, and in my humble opinion, this is where you actually learn something and network. I don't have a large opinion of the neoliberal organizations that we can all say the initials for. So I'm very glad that you're here, and it's important to advocate to your chairs that you need to be going to these conferences. You know, if you put the word national on front of your conference, it becomes national. Seriously, I think you should maybe consider that, because of course we all live and breathe for what looks good on our Vita. So do you know the story of Scheherazade? So a dude was going to kill her somewhere, I can't remember. I think it's India originally, and it's just an old Arabian Nights story. And of course, Arabian Nights has all the ideas that we expect in looking at Middle Eastern people. Of course, this was many, many centuries ago, and unfortunately, it's stuff that is still used in our media today. But I started to think about the 100 million, 100,000 tales that we are being told by the news media at this point about Arabic peoples and about Muslims. And I usually in my language and writing separate the notion of Arabs and Muslims, because not all Muslims are Arab and not all Arabs are Muslim. And when I would speak about somebody from Iran or Iraq, for instance, these are Muslim countries, but they're not Arabic countries. So it's important to understand that. But my interest in this is my interest in Islamophobia, which governs even those Arabs who are not Muslim, but are treated like they are. And as a Jew, it's not a shock to me. I mean, anti-Semitism has been around since the birth of the written word, and certainly Jews and Arabs are both Semites. So I sort of see it as a shared consistency that we've had throughout history. But I just want to talk a bit, as I do in most of my research, with coming from sort of an ethno-autobiographic way of speaking. And I want to take you through about a little bit of my experience, because through my experience with media, I want you to see how I lay out a kind of a media literacy to be used in classrooms and in our work. So this is basically my tales of American terror. I remember in 1962, I was from Los Angeles, and my parents took me to Hollywood to see this movie, Lawrence of Arabia, starring Peter O'Toole. And basically, in a nutshell, it's about the British, who always seem to appear very prominently in destroying most areas of the world, until the Americans came on board. About a man who sent, not a big dude, like sort of a lieutenant, Lawrence Elliott, who goes to Arabia, because in those days Arabia was a peninsula. It was a conglomeration of tribal and nomadic groups of people. It was not primitive. It was structured in a way that was different than Europe. And T.E. Lawrence came, and he basically assumed the position of a benevolent dictator in structuring and preparing the entire peninsula of Arabia to eventually be partitioned by the British and created into little tiny city-states. So my first vision was T.E. Lawrence on a horse with his blue eyes, blonde hair, and flowing scarves, and his best friend, the prince, who was always one step below T.E. Lawrence. So even as a kid, I remember just thinking how this prince guy who was riding these horses, I think it was Omar Sharif, and he was this very incredibly handsome Egyptian man. And as soon as he met Lawrence, he sort of became the one step back sidekick to Lawrence. And so I started to, that was my consciousness. So what I was doing was, when I went back in my histories, revisited my consciousness about Arabs and Muslims. So that was in '62. In the late 60s, Time magazine had a cover about, and I couldn't find it, the case of the Arab refugee. And it was about 1968. Now this is 20 years, or 19 years after Israel had started. And as a Jewish kid growing up, I really only knew that the Jews had a homeland. And there was never any discussion, either religiously or in family or even in school, about what happened to everyone else. And so I remember getting this in my social studies class, and I didn't know there was a case of the Arab refugee. And I didn't know that all over this area, which is referred to sort of inaccurately as the Middle East, tent cities were being raised of Arabic Palestinian people who had lived for as long as the Jews had lived in one area that the British had gone into and partitioned and called Israel. No evidence of what they were going to do with the refugees. Well, bordering countries like Syria and Jordan actually, and still do, have refused to let the refugees in. And how many of you have seen these camps? Anybody? Have you ever seen one? If you drive to Jordan from Israel, or if you go out into the Jericho land, you will still, to this day, see cities not much different like this that have been there since 1948. And the attitude of the Palestinians, and some of you that are old enough to remember Arafat, when he started being a spokesperson for the Palestinians, was reminding everyone in the world that you never decided what to do with us. And they're not Jordanian, they're not Syrian, they are Palestinian. And by creating Israel through a white, colonial, imperialistic country led by the British, the entire millions or thousands of years, generations of the history of Palestine and the lives of Palestinian families were changed forever. I remember that very vividly. It was a very important part of my life. And then I remember later that year, being a Los Angeles kid, that at the Ambassador Hotel, our choice, our chance, 2 months after Martin Luther King was murdered, Robert Kennedy was murdered in the Ambassador Hotel. But what really stuck out in my mind was that a man called Sirhan Sirhan had done it. And every time his name was mentioned on the news, he was called Sirhan Sirhan, a man of Jordanian birth. And I just remember that. Now, the man who murdered Dr. King, supposedly murdered Dr. King, Ray, I have no idea what his heritage is. No idea. I don't know Oswald's heritage. But I remember not putting it together, but I just remember that phrase, a man of Jordanian birth. Is anybody old enough to remember this murder? Do you remember that Jordanian birth being constantly echoed? So that might have been my first true consciousness of just another country, and maybe I had never even heard of Jordan before, but it was just a man of Jordanian birth. In 1970, I do clearly remember sitting at university and watching the Olympics unfold into tremendous horror when the Israeli team of 16 athletes was kidnapped by a group called Black September. Nobody knew what they stood up for, but they captured them. Some assumed it was a Palestinian group, some, nobody was quite sure who these people were. The terror started in the kidnapping and watching, because you would sit and watch with the news reporters, watching across, like at a dorm, at where they held these people. That was part of the terror. But the greatest terror, the most horrendous terror was when the athletes were forced by the kidnappers to go to the Munich airport with a bit of an understanding that there was going to be some sort of separation between them. The German police opened fire and murdered all the athletes and the terrorists. That was Munich. Now, as a Jew, it wasn't too shocking to me that they murdered the Jews too. I really have always maintained, and I was, old enough, I was in university, I was old enough to maintain at that time, had they been Danish athletes or Italian athletes, and in my heart, I do not believe the Germans would have murdered the athletes. And I just think that that was a very interesting time. And that was probably one of the first times that terrorism involving the Middle East really hit the universal stage. 30 years later, Spielberg wrote and produced the movie called Munich, where he tells his version of the story. The last clip of the movie is this picture. And this is where we really get into the notion of the importance of media literacy. Can you all see? We're watching a movie about 1970s Black September group kidnapping an Israeli group and the Germans murdering them. That's the entire story of Munich. And at the very end, there's a scene of one of the terrorists and maybe one of the Mossad Israelis, something like that, people from the movie. Fast forward to the 1970s, and they're in Brooklyn walking their babies down the street. And the movie pans from this guy to the Twin Towers. And this is the ending shot of Munich. This is the kind of tacit media influence that is so present in our lives today. The fact that Spielberg would use his political agenda to push, once again, the fear of Palestinian terrorists. First of all, Osama bin Laden was from Saudi. He was funded by the Americans, and he lived in Pakistan. To anyone's knowledge, he had nothing ever to do with the Black September group. The Black September group never espoused anything that bin Laden did. And if we agree that bin Laden was indeed responsible for the towers, the fact that Spielberg would end with this is what? Give me an idea. What are the words you would think of for this?
Propaganda.
Propagandizing. It hits at the sentimental nature of us. So no matter what we've learned in the movie Munich, this is what we're ending with. And this is the pattern that American and British news agencies, radio, television, and Hollywood has been drumming into our minds since 2011, or 2001, 9/11. And this is the problem that I have. Oklahoma City bombing. Anybody was there with us in San Francisco when this happened? Anybody was there? Were you at AERA? I look at somebody with gray hair. I just assume it's there. AERA 1995 at the Marriott, walking over some what do you call that? Mezzanine, looking down, and all of a sudden, hundreds of people are in the lobby looking at a television. Oklahoma City bombing. We were told over and over for an entire hour that it was suspected to be Arab terrorists. Boston, the murders, the bombings, suspected to be Arab terrorists. Images like this with the word Arab terrorists constantly coming through the waves every time any kind of explosive event has happened in the United States or Britain. Timothy McVeigh became the suspect, and originally who he wasn't, was arrested, subsequently was executed. Never once was there an apology by the American media for saying that most assuredly it was done by Arab terrorists. I remember living in New York, and when 9/11 happened, actually it happened across from my apartment. And I remember I had a lot of Latin students being in New York, a lot of Spanish guys. I also had a lot of